Welcome to another edition of Who's Better Baseball. All-Star game is coming up soon. The deadline not that far away as well. This is really the height of the MLB season. We're going to be talking about all of it here today. Patrick, I'm doing great. I am doing great. My Mets have won 6 in a row. They're talking about Grimace, but I've been writing about more than that today. So there's a lot I want to talk about with this Mets team and everything else. How are things going for you?
Pretty good. Pretty good. Dodgers are in town playing the Rockies. Dodgers still always at the center of the baseball world. This time, maybe for less fortunate reasons. Still, you're right. We're right in that heart of the baseball season where it really gets fun and people realize just how great baseball can be, particularly in the summertime.
Absolutely. And since you mentioned the Dodgers being in town and those unfortunate reasons, let's just jump off right there on that. Mookie Betts gets blown up on his hand. Really unfortunate injury. A guy that we were talking about on our last show as still probably the MVP front runner. And now the Dodgers have to deal without their shortstop. And this was already a question mark. We were kind of going through that as well. Like, is Mookie Betts going to stick at shortstop for the entire season? Now you got Miguel Rojas, who's now the starting shortstop of the Dodgers for the time being. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of answers internally other than that in the meantime, which that'll help him out defensively. And Rojas has been a pretty solid bat this year, but that was in a limited role. Now cast into an everyday spotlight. I don't know if Mickey's going to hold up, and I don't know how the Dodgers are going to hold up without him. Obviously, they'll still make the playoffs, but this is a big, big injury to try to overcome.
Yeah, Miguel Rojas is an everyday player. He was obviously when he was with the Marlins, and he was the last couple of years for the most part, starting 3 every 4 days is what Dave Roberts said on Monday at Coors Field. And so Kike Hernandez was probably going to spell him just a little bit there. It doesn't sound like Chris Taylor is going to get that opportunity, a former shortstop. And Gavin Lux's name did not come up, but I think we all know that that's probably not in the card. So until the trade deadline, they're going to have to stick with their guy there. And even past the trade deadline, knowing that you're going to get Mookie Betts back in the next 6 to 8 weeks, maybe you don't go ahead and target a shortstop, especially since you don't know how long Yoshinobu Yamamoto is out. And if your number 1 and number 2 in your postseason rotation are Walker Buehler and Clayton Kershaw, that sounds good on paper, but you haven't gotten Kershaw back, and Walker Buehler is just starting to build his momentum. So that puts a lot of weight on James Paxton's shoulder. So maybe they end up pivoting and going after some starting pitching, but the Dodgers will be fine there with Rojas at the bottom of the lineup. Probably a better defender, definitely so, a better defender than Mookie Betts. But everybody else just has to step up, and you saw that on Monday night during a 9-5 Dodgers win.
Yeah, it's one of those situations where it's hard to feel too bad for a team that has such a wealth of riches. And look, they can still now roll out Otani and Freeman. The lineup is going to be fine one way or the other, and they're going to make it through the season. They're going to be atop the NLS. But I think it puts them in a more difficult spot as far as trying to figure out what they were going to do at shortstop, which is already a problem. I think if the Dodgers really had it the way they want it and they could have their pick of the litter, my opinion is Mookie Betts would be returning and playing second base or right field, and they would have a shortstop in place from the deadline. The problem is, who is that guy? I mean, I look now, and Willie Adames was the guy everyone was sort of just saying, oh, he'll be a Dodger. You even said it on our last show. Like, we were talking about by the way, go back, watch that show because that conversation changed. If you want to go on YouTube, for those of you watching, we talked about the Dodgers having the MVP candidate or the field. And if you were taking the field last week, you just got a much better chance with this injury. But when it comes to that Adames situation, everyone thought, all right, at the deadline, Brewers will be out of it. It'll just be like Trey Turner years ago, and the Dodgers will swoop in and make a trade for a rental. Now, Adames is not going anywhere, I don't think, from that Brewers team. So the one guy that really jumps to mind as a massive upgrade that could be had is Bo Bichette. Are the Dodgers going to pull the trigger on that kind of move? And are the Blue Jays ready to listen? Because I think that's the one piece that could end up coming in out of all of this that makes the Dodgers even more formidable come October.
I don't know necessarily if that's going to be the guy. That's such a interesting conversation to have because, as I just said, like the starting pitching could be an area where they feel like they don't have the postseason dogs. They've got enough of the regular season guys, and we've seen Gavin Stone obviously step up, and Bobby Miller coming off a really good rookie season. He's getting himself back into the mix. Like they've got enough quantity, but do they
We
have that
should
quality?
it came into my head. We should mention Tyler Glasnow, of course. Tyler Glasnow
Of
has been
course.
unbelievable this year. So he's the ace that you can count on at the moment. But sort of leading into the question overall, we've never seen Tyler Glasnow go beyond whatever it was last year, 120 innings. It seems like he's healthy. It seems like there's not going to be any issues there, but it's still something to think about. I wonder, can they pull off that Scherzer Turner trade 2.0? Like what's that? So is there a Bichette, and I don't know who that starter is. Does Bichette and Kevin Gausman get you excited? But then how much you have to give up, because you're not just talking about some rentals, which I think for Turner and Scherzer was a rental. I think Turner was a year and a half of control. You're talking about Gausman still has a couple years on his deal. He's making good money. You have Bichette still has next year. So in that situation, if you're the Blue Jays, I mean, you could reset your farm system in one trade, but are the Dodgers going to be that aggressive? It's really fascinating to try to find the trade partner, because if you go beyond Bichette, I don't know who the shortstop is. And I think trading for any pitching at this deadline is going to cost a lot by itself.
Yeah, I think Chris Bassett could be that other guy because
Yeah.
I believe his deal is up after 2025. So if you're able to get two for the price of one, and again, it won't be the price of one because you are getting two all-stars in Bichette and Chris Bassett, then yeah, it's going to cost a lot. And maybe that is the thing that moves the needle, where it does allow the Dodgers to have both of those guys. And you get them for next season as well. So now you've got Betts shifted back over to second base and right field, as I think you want, and a lot of Dodgers fans would probably prefer. Could keep him healthier a little bit longer. So yeah, that's where they got to kind of figure out what it is that they want, and they might wait closer to that trade deadline because, as you pointed out with Tyler Glass, now he been able to do it that long and that consistently before? No, he hasn't. But they are paying him like they expect him to have figured out something, figured out how to stay healthy and be durable, and he's shown that so far this year. So with those guys there, behind Glass now, like I said, the Bueller and the Kershaw looks good on paper, but are they going to have those dogs? They'll be fine in the lineup without Betts for 2 months with Rojas there, because Teoscar Hernandez, top 5 in the National League in RBI hitting cleanup, he's okay, right? They'll be able to make those mix and match moves, and the analytics department is fantastic for the Dodgers, so they're going to have the right guys in the right spots. They could end up going with some kind of platoon route if they wanted to do that at shortstop, where they do play Miguel Rojas more frequently, and then on off days Betts is over at shortstop, and maybe they're looking at a second baseman. But I think they got enough of those pieces around that, yeah, it would answer, and it would take care of the big question mark or a big concern to go get a guy like Bo Bichette. But I don't really know that they need to do that.
It's crazy because having Otani and Freeman covers up so much, having Will Smith and Teoscar Hernandez covers up so much, but they're such a top heavy team. And you look at this infield, and I was just looking up right now, like, when's Max Muncy coming back? And he's dealing with an oblique, and it seems like he has just paused his swinging. Obliques can linger. Apparently, it might not be any time in the at least close future here. So you're looking at an infield, and it's pretty much Freddie Freeman, and then a lot of question marks, but they're still going to be fine. I think the one result from all of this is you look at the National League, which has so many teams in the middle, and then there was these top tier teams. It kind of pushes the Phillies even further ahead, where the Phillies should clearly be the team that finishes this year with the best record. And then the Dodgers and the Braves are kind of trying to overcome a lot here. We expect them to be great and to make the playoffs, and I'm sure they will. But I think the question now for them is, all right, we know we're going to get to the dance. How whole can we be once we get there? And that's going to be a matter of what they do at the deadline, what growth they get internally, prospects, anything else, and just trying to keep the pieces that still are healthy on the field throughout the rest of the season.
And if they think they need to go out and get another arm in the bullpen, because you just can't have enough of those
Yeah.
guys, and they're really good at mixing and matching, as we know, and they're really good at picking a guy up off the scrap heap and then really turning him into something. We almost ended up seeing that on Monday night with Michael Peterson, who was a prospect for a couple organizations, was with the Rockies recently, and couldn't really break through AAA. And here he is. He just got called up by the Dodgers, still looking to make his major league debut, a guy who represented Team Great Britain in the last World Baseball Classic. And yet the Dodgers kind of have that magical dust that they could sprinkle on guys and say, hey, no, you're in the right place and we can get something out of you. But is that going to be reliable? Are you going to be able to, rely on that guy throughout the entire month of October? That will be interesting. And so, the Dodgers, they communicate really well with every single team, and they'll get the best deal out there. So, they're going to be adding 3 or 4 pieces, right? They might not all be huge names, but they'll add 3 or 4 pieces for what they think that they're going to need to make this run into the postseason.
We talked about on last week's show the top 4 teams versus the field, and again, that's another video you can find on our YouTube channel right now. But I think to me, what's interesting about those 4 teams, and of course, I'm talking about Phillies, Dodgers, Yankees, Orioles, is they have all the incentive to push the chips forward this year, and they all have the capital to do it. So it's just a matter of which of them will and what those trades look like in a market that is going to be so unpredictable at the deadline. This is actually a topic that we might bring to the show a little bit later down the line, because I'm going to be working on this in written form this week. Just what has this third wild card done to the market when you look at free agency and then the trade market? It really does make things so interesting, because you have a National League right now where every team outside of your Rockies and the Marlins are pretty much in the mix. Those two are the only ones who maybe are the outside looking in as clear sellers. So you really don't know which team is going to decide, all right, we'll take advantage and we'll sell. And I think the few teams that do will probably sell a lot of different pieces, similar to what we saw from the Mets and the White Sox last year. And they'll get a lot of value. But if you're a team in the middle, are you the one pushing the chips forward, or one of these heavy hitters going to be the team that says, you know what, we got a 100-win club here. Let's make sure that we have that ace. And you can look at the Orioles, you can look at the Dodgers, and both of those teams can use an arm. You can look at the Phillies and say they need a bat. The Dodgers, maybe they need a bat. It's going to be really interesting to see how those 4 teams in particular try to play this deadline.
I think it's going to break down late, just like I said with the Dodgers, maybe waiting to see which of their pitchers break down, if any, or if they do sustain any other injuries, who they're gonna go after at that point. And so there could be a lot of teams really late, right? Both deciding, hey, we're buyers, and hey, we're sellers. And so I think that's going to add a lot of intrigue, where if we don't get some of the bigger names that we're expecting or we've been used to expecting at the trade deadline, the flurry of activity, I think, will just make it all the more interesting. And you could maybe even see a team make like 3 trades in one day and acquire a player from 3 different divisions, and maybe going into a game shorthanded to a degree, right, where they've got like 2 guys on the bench because of all these deals. So it could get chaotic, but chaos is a very good thing when it comes to baseball sometimes.
Yeah, it's going to make for a lot of very interesting storylines once we get there. Let's look at the Betts injury now from a league-wide perspective. What's this going to do to the MVP race? And like we said, he was the front runner. Now, I think you look at his teammate, Shohei Ohtani. Okay, maybe there's no more splitting votes. If Ohtani's there all year, he might be the guy, but he is a DH. Bryce Harper, we talked about him last time. Which names are you looking at now as guys that can all of a sudden grab an award?
We talked about this recently. Fernando Tatis Jr. is one of those guys. Padres taking a small step back, so they've got to be a lot better. Bryce Harper, where he's injected right in there. Leo Morgenstern is got an article coming out soon about all the Just Baseball All-Star game selections, right? And at the end of the day, I had to pick Bryce Harper over Freddie Freeman there. And Bryce Harper is obviously in that conversation as MVP. I don't know if we're going to see any of the pitchers step up. There's obviously a couple that are going to garner some attention, like a Ranger Suarez and a Shota Imanaga. We'll talk about him in just a moment. So I think it definitely changes the conversation, where it might be Shohei Ohtani now. I think there's still a chance it could be Mookie Betts, depending if he can miss on the short end of the 6 weeks, right? And he misses 36 games. Man, can he do enough in the remaining 126 to still stay in there? There's a chance for that as well, but it at least allows some room for other names to get into the conversation as at least the top 3 vote candidate.
Yeah, you look at the top of the F4 leaderboard, and now Otani's actually overtaken Betts based on some of the offensive numbers. 19 home runs for Shohei Ohtani, 16 stolen bases. He's been unbelievable. Ketel Marte is the really interesting one. Like it comes down to narrative, right? So you look at Ketel Marte, Ellie De La Cruz. Can they take a team that is in this jumble of NL wildcard hopefuls and carry them to a playoff berth? That might carry a lot of weight in the voting process. And then you can look at some of the pitchers too and say, all right, is this the year where things open up and a pitcher can win the award? When is the last time we've seen a pitcher win the MVP? Was it Kershaw? I'm trying to think back. Kershaw and Verlander are the two that jump out as guys that have won MVPs. But you typically need to have almost a triple crown type season where you're leading in wins, innings, strikeouts, ERA, whatever it is. You have to pretty much just kind of run the gamut to what are the 3 to win the triple crown? I just lost my help me out here.
For pitching Triple Crown, which again, it's a thing that no one really cares that much about. I believe it's wins, ERA, and then WHIP.
Right? WHIP? I don't think it's WHIP. 3? I don't think it's WHIP. I think
strikeouts.
I think it's strikeouts. Yeah, I think it's strikeouts. I threw innings in there. I think it's strikeouts. Man, that's bad. We're a baseball show that doesn't know the Triple Crown, but hey.
Well, again, the Triple Crown for pitchers is just, again, it's not really discussed. I think that's a newer invention. Like, look, the Triple Crown has been around since the start of baseball, since the early 1900s. That was an acknowledged thing, right? You can see pictures of Babe Ruth wearing a crown on his head, right? Because he had the best batting average, most home runs, most RBI. And 2 of those 3 statistics don't really carry as much weight as they did in the past. The pitching Cy Young is something brand new that was created. But look, I think this could be one of those years where the door gets open for a pitcher where, okay, Mookie Betts, he's the best player. He's the most valuable because he moved from right field / second base over to shortstop, but he didn't really play enough. Okay, he's out. Shohei Ohtani, can he get to 30-30, right? He stole, I think, his 16th base last night. But he's a DH, so you might have to rule him out. Freddie Freeman, you might have to rule him and Teoscar Hernandez out because they've got 2 other better players on their team. So right there, you've got all of the Dodgers that you could theoretically cross out using that kind of logic. And, we know the Phillies have a bunch of stars. And Ranger Suarez, is he stealing votes for Bryce Harper? So, it's going to take an otherworldly performance from a pitcher, and there are strong odds against it. But there's already a couple dominoes that have fallen here that suggest, you know what, if somebody does win 25 games, which Ranger Suarez may be the only one who can do that, then people might take notice and say, you know what, I think this could be a year for a starting pitcher to win the MVP.
Yeah, it's all about the narrative, and it's Suarez, like you said, he's 10-1. So can he post an absurd record? Let's just double that and say he's 20-2. And he maintains a sub-2 ERA. At some point, that's going to look pretty impressive when you stack it up against the competition. And there's other guys as well that potentially can do it. Ultimately, it's probably going to be a position player. And when you mentioned the Triple Crown, for one, shout out to Grover Cleveland Alexander. 3 Triple Crowns in the early 1900s. And it is wins, strikeouts, and, oh my God, I lost it again. Wins, strikeouts, and innings. That ultimately
I wouldn't have guessed that. Yes.
Oh no, it's ERA, man.
Win, strikeouts, ERA.
You know what? I had it. I had it, and then I closed the tab and I forgot it. I mean, that's how forgettable the Triple Crown is to me.
Whip didn't even exist when.
Let's throw out the pitcher Triple Crown.
No, hold on. I'm going to tell you a story about Grover Cleveland Alexander.
Okay, go ahead.
So, a couple things. One, he's the only player in baseball history to share the same name as a U.S. president, Grover Cleveland, and he's the only player in MLB history to also both have a president play him in a movie, Ronald Reagan. Now, the dude was a raging alcoholic, but that was accepted at the time because he suffered from epileptic seizures. And
Oh,
one way to keep epilepsy under control is to drink heavily. So that's Grover Cleveland Alexander, aka Old Pete. If you go back and look when they opened the Hall of Fame, I think the first year was 1937. There's a photograph of all the like original 12 guys that got in. 5 was the first class, but if you look at all 12, he's this old dude, tall, and he's got the thickest, darkest black hair. Even in a black and white photo, his hair looked amazing. Grover Cleveland Alexander. We're going to clip this one because this is good for SEO. Grover Cleveland Alexander. I don't know if you know that, but this whole segment, just cut this out, post it separately. Million views probably by Friday night.
I hope so. We'll just drown out my embarrassing lack of Triple Crown knowledge. Speaking of which, Marcell Ozuna Triple Crown watch. Is there a world? I talked about it last week. Is there a world where Marcell Ozuna wins the Triple Crown and voters are just forced to be like, I guess it's Ozuna's the MVP this year? Probably not, but it's something to follow. I mean, he's having a ridiculously good season.
That will be something to think about when the season ends, so that again the postseason performance doesn't muddy the conversation. But everyone sit down, make your ballot, just look at the numbers and the contributions, and kind of forget the sordid history of Marcell Ozuna and say, here's where he probably should finish, give or take a spot or two. And it'll be interesting to see if voters, again, when they go to the ballot and they send theirs in, if they just drop Ozuna down a little bit more and you say, wow, he really deserved a number 4 spot, probably an NL MVP voting, considering the fact that there hasn't been a ton of other guys that have been performing this year for Atlanta. Like, he deserves 4th and then he ends up getting 7th. That's not a huge deal, but that probably wouldn't happen to any other player when you say you're going to drop 3 spots when you deserve to be a lot higher. I wonder why. And again, we do know why. So yeah, that will be an interesting thing to watch by the end of the season when they announce the MVP award winners in sometime in November.
Yeah, I think people are going to take Ozuna's past and they'll hold it against him a little bit more, and rightfully so, compared to even someone like Tatis, who had a PED suspension. I think it's enough in the rearview mirror with him that he can still end up winning this award, and I don't think voters will hold it against him too much now, a year removed from it. I want to throw another MVP candidate in the mix, and it's going to transition us into our next topic. Maybe a team I cover a little bit, the New York Mets. Do you know that since April 10th, now 60-game sample size, Francisco Lindor is leading the National League in wins above replacement at 2.9. He's been unbelievable. I don't think that he's necessarily going to win the MVP, but I'll tell you what, he has been the most valuable player to the Mets, by a landslide. If you go back to this stretch, and I just did an article about the Mets for us at Just Baseball, and it was based on my podcast today with Locked On Mets. And the lead into the conversation is Grimace, how everyone's talking about Grimace. And I want to focus on what's happening on the field and how this 6-game winning streak that has coincided with Grimace throwing out the first pitch at a Mets game, the winning stretches back the last 3 weeks. And what happened was Jorge Lopez launched his glove into the stands. We talked about it on this show, how the Mets were a disaster at the time. And Francisco Lindor, after that incident, locks the door to the clubhouse, holds a player-only meeting about accountability. And JD Martinez has since said, as a guy who's been around this league a long time, it's the best players-only meeting he's ever been a part of. And the message of the meeting was pretty simple. Hold yourself accountable. If you can look at yourself in the mirror and you can really feel good about your process and you've done everything you can to be the best player you can be, well, then that's all that matters. It's been about having more fun and taking some of the pressure off. Everybody thinks the Mets are the worst team. Well, let's just go out and play and not worry about it. Coming off of that meeting, do you know what Francisco Lindor did in that first game?
17 home runs.
Yes. No. So close. First game off of it, he gets a leadoff hit. He's been batting leadoff for a while now. He steals second base, gets stranded. Third inning, he hits a solo home run. 7th inning, his last at bat of a 4-for-4 day, he ties the game in a 2-1 game. And then JD Martinez ends up hitting a home run that proves to be the difference. We have since seen Lindor and Martinez really spark this run for the Mets. And, between holding the players only meeting, standing in front of the New York media for 11 minutes after that meeting, and just being accountable to his club, and then his play ever since. I got to tell you, it's been really impressive to watch Francisco Lindor. And I think as we even get into our all-star conversation in a minute here, he's pretty deserving of some acclaim this season with what he's done to really shake off what was a horrible start.
The thought of Francisco Lindor as a National League MVP candidate did, in fact, make me grimace, right? I winced a bit and thought, I think I don't know that he's a problem, but there's been a lot of issues with him in that Mets clubhouse. And so knowing that he's the one who held the closed door meeting or was at the front of it, and JD Martinez saying it was one of the best closed door meetings, team only, players only meeting that he's ever witnessed, and talking about accountability. I wonder if Francisco Lindor stood up and said, like, look, I've not done a great job in a lot of different ways, and was just brutally honest. I don't know. That would be pure speculation, but it feels like when there are issues with the Mets, there are issues with Francisco Lindor. And if they're playing really well, it's got to be something to do with, Francisco Lindor being at the forefront of that and being open and honest and taking accountability and standing in front of the media and saying that after maybe some issues that he had, of course, fighting with Jeff McNeil, and both those guys I'm sure are equally accountable in that, just standing up there and taking strike three, and just other little things that maybe seem a little lackadaisical, for him to maybe get that message and understand the assignment that he is a valuable player. We saw it in Cleveland. We've seen him do it at times for the Mets, that if he can really lead by example, then other guys can follow and pick up the slack on that. And it's absolutely worked for the Mets. And so it wouldn't surprise me that Lindor really held his own feet to the fire in that way, because it seems like, he could be, again, the gift and the curse in that clubhouse a little bit, because the Mets are tied to him, right? He's going to be around. Pete Alonso, we don't know about, but Francisco Lindor, we do. And so maybe this is a change in attitude and mindset and the way he goes about his business. And if that's true, then the Mets are definitely going to benefit from it.
I think from watching every game of this 4-year tenure with Lindor and the Mets, I think there has been some narratives that have formed from the 2021 season where he started off bad, and there was the booing situation where he didn't know how to handle it, and then he did the thumbs down celebration with Javi Baez, and that created a firestorm. There was the fight with McNeil, though I think the fight itself was more about McNeil and not paying attention to defensive positioning. But after the whole making up a story to the New York media, Lindor has come a really long way from where he was in year one in New York to year four. And it's a big change. You go from playing in Cleveland, where you were just the beloved son of the city, right? You came up as a 21-year-old. Year two, you lead the team to the World Series. And, he said it recently. He said in Cleveland, it would be like he would go like 0 for 50 before he'd hear it. In New York, if he goes 0 for 8, he starts to hear it. And that's the adjustment that you have to make. And he had to make that adjustment also on the heels of signing a $341 million contract before he played a game. So as someone who's watched the whole thing, I think he's got a really bad rap for things that he can't really control. He's been a 6-win player the last 2 years, and he's now on pace again to be probably a 6-win player. It's a 60-game sample where he's put up basically 3 wins. I mean, if you extrapolate that over a full season, he's been even better than that. This is a guy that has really embraced leadership this year in a way I hadn't quite seen in the past. In the offseason, he had personal moments where he took Mark Vientos and Brett Beatty aside for like extended weekends and helped them with their defense. And here are 2 guys that have showed up this year, young players, who have been dramatically better defensively. So seeing things like that, seeing the way he's handled the media through his struggles, helping the Mets into this point, I cannot be more of a advocate for this guy as someone who covers him and can see what he's done. And yeah, he probably isn't going to win the MVP, but damn it if he's not a really good player that's worth that contract that gets way too much slander, particularly from his own fan base that still doesn't embrace him despite how good he's been.
And he's getting slander from your co-host. So you're right. He's getting it everywhere. And some guys, right, it can take that that amount of time to mature into the player that the franchise thinks they're going to be. And even with all of those struggles that he's had and those adjustments to being this superstar player, or a player who's had the superstar tag placed upon him, certainly because of that large contract, there are other guys that just can't do it at all for 1 minute. So he's still been able to post, and he's one of those players where at the end of every year you look at the numbers and they're really strong. And I know wins above replacement kind of, I'm not gonna say favors him, but he's one of those players where you look at his numbers and sometimes I think maybe it's because it's more batting average. You go, wow, all right, that's a little bit more valuable than I would have guessed. So he's doing enough of those things right, obviously. So it's nice for the Mets fan base to have him there as a leader. And look, we've talked about it a lot, how these narratives get started in media and in the sports world, and something either for a good or bad reason, right? It gets attention. But in New York, on the East Coast, with a team that is really struggling to find their identity and having these overpriced players, but at the same time, some of those overpriced players are on other teams. And is Steve Cohen gonna figure some things out? Well, it turns out he had the pieces before he even bought the franchise. They were already there. The best guy for the job and for the task of winning a World Series was already on the roster, and it was Francisco Lindor. So I think very quickly these things can kind of begin to change. And I've seen it many times, Ryan. You put something out there into the ether, and then all of a sudden, whether it's because someone specifically heard you say it or not, it builds this momentum. And all of a sudden, hey, why isn't Francisco Lindor getting enough MVP conversation? Why isn't he getting enough attention for that? And I think we're going to start to see that happening because of this win streak.
Yeah, if they can maintain this and if he can keep this play going, I mean, it's crazy because again, I tell you, the last 60 games, he has been the most valuable player in the National League, and he's only played 71 games this season. So 11 games at the beginning has been a hole that he has tried to dig himself out of all year, and that's what happens when you start 1 for 31. But he's done that, and we'll see how much he can continue to climb out of that hole. But he has added, since he's switched to the leadoff spot, he has added 115 points on his OPS in a single month. So that tells you how hot he's been, how hot the Mets have been. And we will continue to monitor the NL wildcard race because it's so many teams that are right there. I mean, it's 9 teams separated by 4 games right now, 8 teams separated by 2 games. So it's something that is not going away. That's going to be the conversation that we're going to have all throughout the next month and a half as teams have to decide if they are in or out on this season for the deadline.
It feels like this race that we're talking about for the 3 wild card spots isn't a race of the tortoise versus the hare. It's tortoise versus tortoise because no one's breaking away from the pack, and it's really just hold on, survive, try to stay as close to 500 as possible, and not go off on a sprint like the hare. It's tortoise versus tortoise in the National League right now.
I mean, the Cardinals have shot up just by virtue of not falling under. Where like the Padres were sitting comfortably in that second wild card spot. The Mets sweep them, and I think they've got off to a rough start. I don't know if they're playing the Phillies now. I think Phillies or Braves. I'm not sure which, but regardless, they've won. I think they've lost like four or 5 in a row. Now they're sitting in this position where they've fallen from second to they're out of the picture. It is pretty crazy. Just play 500. Get yourself over and play 500 for the rest of the year. If you get to 4 games over and you play 500 baseball, you're probably going to be in the playoffs in the National League with how weak the rest of this league is.
Yeah, very true. It's interesting. The trade deadline, I think, is going to end up shifting and all. And I think it's just one of the positive things about having the wild card. And I think folks might have been worried when there were 3 that, well, everyone's going to be in it, so then no one's going to be trading. And we haven't really had that problem. It's just kind of kept more teams relevant. Whereas in seasons past with 1 wild card or even 2, it just feels like there would be no shot whatsoever. This wouldn't have been one of those seasons with 2 wild cards because it's really Atlanta as the top wild card team, and they're legit, right? They're 8 games over 500, but then the second wild card is only 1 game over, so anybody can have that. With 3, now all teams are really in the conversation, and I think that keeps it fun and it keeps those teams and the fan bases relevant and invested, deeper into the summer.
If there was ever a year where the third wild card would get in with like 79 wins, kind of like your 7-9 football team or whatever from the
Yeah.
past. It would be this season, but I think ultimately there's going to be a couple teams that post deadline figure some things out, and we're going to look at it by the end of the season. I think it's going to be, the wild cards are probably all going to have 85, 86 wins or more, because there's going to be enough that put it all together. But at this juncture, it's hard to figure out who that team is going to be. Let's move over to the All-Star game. We want to talk some sleepers here. The first voting results are in. We're not necessarily going over guys today that are going to be voted into the All-Star game. It's guys who might make it that we haven't really talked about as much. So let's start in the American League. You want to go around the diamond? Give me a name that jumps out as a potential All-Star for this season that we were not expecting coming into the year.
I think Jordan Westberg has to be at the top of that list over at third base. Dude's got a 1,000 OPS against teams that are 500 or better. And with the first round of voting, or maybe not round, but the first release of voting results, Jordan Westberg is number 2 behind Jose Ramirez for that vote. So he'll be in the finals, and I don't know that he'll necessarily win that. But you put his numbers alongside Jose Ramirez, a lot of them do match up. Some of them don't. But even still, Jordan Westberg has been a big part of the Orioles' success, whereas we thought Jackson Holliday was going to inject that bit of life. No, it's the kid from Texas A&M, Jordan Westberg.
He's been amazing. It's very easy to get overshadowed in Baltimore right now when Gunnar Henderson is hitting home runs seemingly every other day, and Adley Rutschman is the face of the franchise. There's a lot of guys that deserve credit for what they've done, but Jordan Westberg not talked about nearly enough, and I think an All-Star recognition is certainly going to be a good way to get his name out there for people to realize, oh yeah, there's another guy who's playing right next to Gunnar in that infield who's done really well this season. Speaking of the Guardians, Jose Ramirez probably starts, but there's a couple of names, Stephen Kwan and David Fry, guys that don't typically get a lot of national talk. Kwan in particular, batting title at this point seems to be in his grasp. He's just ridiculous. And David Fry, we had an article go up on him this week because he is one of the most insane stories to see this guy who is just putting up ridiculous numbers. He catches sometimes, plays outfield, DHs. I mean, he's just one of these guys that one way or the other, they get his name into the lineup and he's producing.
Is the name of the article, Who the Hell is David Fry?
That's how I assign those to our writers. Is I say, hey, we need a Who the Hell is David Fry article, and then we kind of clean it up for. I think his actually might be an unlikely all-star piece, which is something we've been doing here for a couple years of Just Baseball. I remember the first one I think we did was Brandon Drury with the Reds a couple years ago, and I wrote an unlikely all-star case, and it's sort of been a series we followed through on. We'll probably do some more of them throughout. I might need to take some notes for our editors meeting after this podcast, because some of these names just certainly deserve to be written about. But David Fry, the first one that we've done as an unlikely all-star who has provided great value this season.
Kwan, I think, is in the top 6 right now in voting, so he'll end up going on to phase 2 more than likely. So he's getting a lot of support from fans in Cleveland. And I think David Fry is close. He's like around 3 or 4. So depending on what happens going forward, he might even sneak in there as one of the finalists. Will either of those guys win? Again, that remains to be seen. But Cleveland could be doing the Kansas City Royals thing where they're really stuffing the ballot and supporting their guys. I don't think Kwan's going to be able to get in past Judge, Soto, and Kyle Tucker, but maybe David Fry surprises as a starter. Bottom line is, even if that doesn't happen, they are very well in line to become a first-time starter. And then also in the outfield, I think you mentioned him. I think he might be, if we're keeping track of ya boys, I think Jarren Duran. I don't know. You brought him up at some point, but Jarren Duran, ya boy, he might be a first-time All-Star this year as well.
He's been great. He's been great for the Red Sox. We actually had an article up this week about 5 sort of underrated Red Sox because they've had a lot of guys who have been really good, and Wilyer Abreu is another one. But Duran, you're looking at the F4 leaderboards among American leaguers, and he's in the top 10, as is Stephen Kwan, who's at number 6. 398 average for Kwan, by the way. He's just got to get qualified. He's got that bag title locked up. And it's funny, there was a lot of talk last year when Arise was flirting with 400, Has anyone mentioned Stephen Kwan flirting with 400? Because I knew that he was out in front in batting average. I did not realize that through 43 games played, he did have an injury, but that he was hitting 398 with a 456 on base. That's absurd.
And he was at like, I was going to say only. He was only at 380 like a couple days ago. So, yeah, he's had a couple good games. You're right. He doesn't qualify yet. He does play in Cleveland, doesn't hit for any power whatsoever. So, I think there's a reason why that's not being discussed just yet. But in the next couple weeks, that very well could change for a guy who already has a Gold Glove award for center field. He did that as a rookie. So Stephen Kwan, I think, is a good bet to be in Texas this summer.
Something about these bat to ball guys that you have to love. Kwan, Arise, these guys that will probably hang around for a long time, will probably never be paid or valued exactly how they should, because it's funny, Kwan, at least maybe with the defense, I think that probably helps him, because at least he actually does get that WAR love that Arise doesn't, because he doesn't really pick it particularly well. But these guys that when you watch the Guardians, like I think batting average isn't really valued until you're watching the teams day in and day out. And there's something about the guy that's hitting 300, because the guy that's hitting 300 is just consistently putting up hits when there's so many peaks and valleys for others, where you see guys that fall into the slumps. These guys don't. And if a guy's hitting close to 400, it's a whole nother level. So Kwan definitely deserves it. David Fry potential as well. Duran. Any other names that we got on the American League side that we should spotlight here?
Yeah, I'm gonna talk about a player. Actually, I'm not gonna talk about a player. I'm gonna ask you about a player and make it just a completely different topic whatsoever. Who would you rather have for the next 6 to 7 years? Francisco Lindor or Anthony Volpe? Because Anthony Volpe right now, since he's been inserted as a leadoff hitter for the Yankees, OPS near in and around 900. And again, we know Francisco Lindor is kind of, he's making his case for the Hall of Fame. He's obviously in that conversation. I think he might have to compile a little bit more, but he's safe to go. Volpe, year 2, right? But much younger. So if we're talking 6 to 7 years, go ahead, light up social media right now in all of New York. Ryan, who would you rather have for the next 6 or 7 years for New York shortstops, Francisco Lindor or Anthony Volpe?
What kind of question is that? Of course it's Lindor, but I will give you the acknowledgement that at this stage of the season, they're actually even when it comes to wins above replacement. So there is something to be said about that for sure. Anthony Volpe at 2.6 wins above replacement, Lindor 2.6. But as I mentioned, Lindor last 60 games been a 2.9 F4. He had a minus 0.3 in the first 11. That has held him back a little bit. For me, it's the power difference. Like Anthony Volpe, I don't know if he's going to ever be a 30 home run hitter, where Lindor last year went 30-30 and did so with, like, I think it was bone spurs in his elbow, and he still put up a 30-30 season. So you cannot get me to slander or put anybody above Francisco Lindor. I've said Francisco Lindor is the best shortstop in baseball. And while Gunnar Henderson and Bobby Witt are making me have to retreat a little bit because of how good some of these young guys are, I will not dare put Anthony Volpe ahead of Francisco Lindor. Get out of here with that. Lindor is the guy that you want, because one way or the other, the numbers are going to be there, and so are the games played too. I think durability, defense, and production. I take Lindor every time, but there's a conversation to be had. I'll give you that.
I should have said in 7 years, who would you rather have?
Yeah, when Lindor's 37 and Volpe's like 30 or whatever 30. He is. Yeah, probably. But I'll take the next 5 years of Francisco Lindor at shortstop over, I'd say, pretty much anybody not named Gunnar and Witt. Seager, of course, is really good as well. But my whole debate has always been on Seager, Lindor. I just know Lindor is going to play. I don't know that about Corey Seager. But
that could be. There's another article, right? What's the all-star team in 2030? The starters, right? And you go, Volpe, okay, maybe. Well, if he's still in the American League, he's got to get past Gunnar Henderson and Bobby Witt Jr. So, you know what? Maybe Francisco Lindor could be a 37-year-old shortstop starting the all-star game.
If you want to write that one up, you have my permission to write up the 2030 all-star. That's a tough one. Trying to figure that one out, do the math and all those. Let's actually move over to the National League and talk about some unlikely all-stars over there under the radar guys. Give me some names that jump out to you that you think might get some all-star recognition this time of year.
I think Joey Ortiz of the Milwaukee Brewers has to be top on that list. Now, the NL outfield is cluttered with a lot of non-all-stars, so to speak. It's not very good. And third base, I think, is kind of similar. Alec Boehm will very likely, win that award. He actually has over 1 million votes. If you look at the top 5 players with the most votes right now, with these first results that have gone out, I think it was Mookie Betts, Ronald Acuna Jr., Bryce Harper, Alec Boehm, and then number 5 is Jurickson Profar, which, how about that for a mind blow? But after Alec Boehm, you've got a bunch of guys that can stake claim to third base, and it really may just, wind up, what team needs an all-star? Will the Rockies have to put get Ryan McMahon there as their selection? Maybe Ezekiel Tovar gets in, and that frees up some space at third base. But just on his own, Joey Ortiz, I think, has been, really fantastic. A lot of guys in that clubhouse have been talking about, how foolish the Orioles were for trading away a stud like that the Brewers now have for 6 seasons. So he's got an OPS over 1,000 against teams playing better than 500, a 137 OPS plus just as of a couple days ago. So the dude definitely deserves a lot more attention and is one of the big reasons why the Brewers are in first place in the NL Central.
It's funny because people will say, man, what were the Orioles doing? And then why don't you rewind this conversation about 10 minutes? We were talking about Jordan Westburg. That's why they did it, because they have the depth to be able to trade an Ortiz and not feel it. They still have guys in the minor leagues. They have Norby, they have Mayo, they have all these different players and that's not even mentioning Jackson Holliday, who could factor into their infield mix at some point in time in the future as well. They have an embarrassment of riches, but Ortiz was the headliner of that Corbin Burnes trade, and it's worked out really well for Milwaukee up to this point. Kind of another thing that's almost an aside on this, but we're going to have a piece come up this week about that trade, revisiting, actually not that trade, the Josh Hader trade, and all of the different implications from it. And one of the things I think is interesting is I believe the Brewers sort of learned their lesson on, all right, if you want to trade a guy, do it in the offseason. Don't have that internal struggle at the deadline. And Willy Adames, I think, is an example of that now. They're probably going to hang on to him. But they made the right decision by trading Burnes when they did. They got a guy that's going to start at that position for 6 years, or maybe not just at third. He might move to shortstop. That's great value. And also, you put on our notes here as well, Bryce Durang at second base. He's been unbelievable for them as well. He certainly could be in this all-star consideration. So the Brewers have just found a way to a really great lineup this season. It's carried them to be really the clear front runner in that Central.
Do you think Brandon Nimmo has a shot at making the all-star team this year? Again, that outfield kind of is a little bit weak after both Fernando Tatis Jr. and Jurickson Profar. And after that, there's no one that really jumps out in any way, either in name or in productivity.
So that's perfect, because what I actually wanted to do, to kind of wrap this, is look at shortstop and outfield in particular as positions that are really in flux, I think, for who's going to be part of this all-star game. Profar, like you mentioned, okay, we can check him off. Tatis, probably. So we're giving Padres two outfielders potentially there. You have Elliot Ramos for the Giants, who has been absurdly good. I think he might be an all-star. The guy, in short order, in 36 games, he is now third in F4 among National League outfielders. 36 games. The two guys ahead of him have been there all year in Profar and Tatis. And then you have Yelich, who's at 46 games played. He's the other guy that's got the 2 wins. So I look at those 4 as guys that should be all-stars. Then it's Teoscar Hernandez as another name. Jazz Chisholm potentially is the Marlins all-star. Jackson Merrill has been great for the Padres. I don't know if he actually gets consideration with the other 2 probably getting the nod. But Brandon Nimmo has never been an all-star. And he really went through a slump lately where he was struggling a lot. Really in the 3-hole. I think he was striking out about 40% of the time. They moved him to the 2-hole, and he's been 10 for his last 20 since batting second. So if Brandon Nimmo can keep this up over the next month and the Mets are winning games, I do think he might finally get his first All-Star appearance, because that outfield is a lot different than it's been in years past. There's no more Betts. There's no more Soto. There's no more Harper. Some of these guys that were perennial all-stars have either moved positions or moved leagues or are hurt. And so I think that does open the door for a guy like Nimmo to finally get that recognition.
Yeah, definitely a changing of the guard. Kind of strange to think that a guy signs a $100 million free agent contract before he signs his first All-Star game contract, right? Yeah, I'll play for the National League. So that is strange how that worked out for Nimmo. So yeah, I think there's a lot of room for guys like that. And again, the Mets building up that momentum, and a guy who's been around for a while may be more likely to get a nod than an Elliot Ramos, who, just hasn't been doing it for quite as long this year, doesn't qualify for any of the stats, but has been really good. It really will depend on if there's any other Giants that get a nod. You got to think Logan Webb's going to be there. So Ramos could be kind of left out in the cold maybe in the first announcement of All-Stars, and then as players fall off to injuries, or I don't know, they're going on their honeymoon in the middle of the season. I forget what all the Astros excuse was in 2021 for not showing up to the All-Star game. But there'll be room to add other players. And yeah, I think Nimmo is going to be an All-Star for the first time this year.
Well, you know me, of course, I certainly hope so. Can Lindor make it? Let's close here on the shortstops. So Betts probably wins the vote, right? Even though he's going to be hurt, we imagine Betts is going to be voted. Would he get voted in the second phase? Who's the other? Is it Ellie? Who's the other guy that's up next to him right now? Do you have the votes?
I believe it is Ellie De La Cruz. And it's funny because, again, Leo Morgenstern put out the survey, and my answer was Mookie Betts, parentheses, Willy Adames, because he should almost kind of come off the ballot. Like we're a month away essentially from the All-Star game, and we know he's not going to play. So should he just come off the ballot? No, look, these things, some of it has to do with bonuses, right? That players can get in their contract. So he's going to stay on it. He'll still probably win. And you're right. There's a lot of really solid candidates. I mean, Ezekiel Tovar has been solid for the Rockies. CJ Abrams has been a big part of some of the national success. You could look at Mason Wynn and say, all right, I can maybe make a case for him if you're just looking at OPS, despite the fact that he doesn't have a ton of homers. We've mentioned Adames. We've mentioned Francisco Lindor. O'Neal Cruz is got highlights all the time, just hitting balls 115 plus miles an hour on a regular basis. Ha-Sung Kim started off the year seemingly as like the Padres MVP. I mean, there's far too many candidates, and there's going to be some people left out in the cold. But if Lindor continues to play the way that he's been, I think that narrative, right, that you've now started and perpetuated, which makes sense, right? He is one of the reasons why the Mets are doing as well as they've been. And if that can continue over the next 3-4 weeks, then he needs to be there to represent that, especially as their best player.
Yeah, it's interesting because I don't know how many Mets All-Stars you get when your team's still probably not going to be completely at the forefront. Luis Severino's pitched really well, but I think Lindor and Nimmo are the two that you look at. And then you look at the rest of the shortstop position. If I had to pick a starter, and I'm glad you mentioned it twice, I've written it down on my notes. I was the one that told Leo, say, hey, Leo, let's see if we could organize this, like, because he did a poll prior to the season that I thought was a really fun article. So let's poll our staff again. He did a great job organizing it. I still haven't submitted my ballot, so I need to do that. I can't let that fall flat myself here. But when I look at the guy that I think should start, to me, I think it's Ellie De La Cruz, because the All-Star is about showcasing, the best and brightest of the game. And when you look at 37 stolen bases and very similar offensive stats beyond that between Adames and Ellie, I think the 37 steals and just the marketability of Ellie probably pushes him into the starting lineup if they have to make a choice there. But Adames definitely deserves it. And then I don't know how many other shortstops you get. It really is, at this point, someone from that group of Lindor. Tovar's right there when you look at WAR.
Second most extra base hits in the NL, Ezekiel Tovar.
And I mean, if you'd have to tell me, as someone who's been covering this team all year, who deserves an All-Star nod more? Is it McMahon or is it Tovar? If you had to pick your Rockies All-Star, who would you pick?
Ooh, that's tough. I think I would actually go with Ezekiel Tovar over Ryan McMahon. Look, there's a reason why the Rockies extended the 22-year-old shortstop. He's a leader in the clubhouse already at such a young age, and he's almost the antithesis of Ellie De La Cruz. Which again, you look at the numbers, and outside of stolen bases, you go, man, they line up really well. In fact, it probably favors Tovar. Why haven't I seen this guy? Why he's just not flashy. He's just so incredibly sound and consistent and mature. I mean, he's already a father too. It became a father last year. I think it might have even been before he was 22 years old. So like this is a really mature man, young man. And I think, you know, a lot of the success that the Rockies have had this year has been, you know, because of him and just how steady he stayed all season long. Both he and Ryan McMahon strike out a ton. So does Ellie De La Cruz. It's just a part of the game nowadays. But I think Tovar deserves that nod just a little bit more than Ryan McMahon.
Yeah, I think a lot of times these conversations when it comes to the teams that won All-Star, it's unfortunate because then it gets into the idea of, okay, well, where can we fill out this roster? Where can we? And that's where I think you might have been right initially, where you thought McMahon might be the guy, because there are more shortstops potentially that could get pushed in. Where you look at third base and it's Bohm, it's Ortiz, and then it's McMahon. You can kind of make the case. Who knows? Maybe Ortiz gets snubbed, right? Where they're just trying to fit pieces in on the bench, and you have a guy like him who doesn't make it because they need to give the Rockies their all-star. But those two have definitely been really good this year and worthy of that recognition. We'll see how all these benches get filled out when we get down to it in about a month here.
I'll say this: McMahon was fourth in third base voting when they released the updated votes so far. Tovar was all the way down in 10th. But I think really what might end up happening is Terry Lavello, he might just send an email, a Google survey to all the NL managers and go, look, there's not a ton of really good outfield options. Everyone's got a really good shortstop. Pick one. Third basemen, all the third basemen are looking really solid. Who's the guy that you want to get in? And then we'll figure it out from there. And like, I honestly think there is a degree of truth to that with certain guys who are our managers will say, look, we prefer this guy over that guy. We want him to make it. So I don't think they're going to be actually sending out a survey, but it's not a bad idea. I might have to talk with some of my buddies who cover the Diamondbacks, like float that idea out there. Like, Tori, how are you going to make these decisions? That's it. Survey or ping pong balls and just write all the players' names.
Yeah.
Pick it out. There you go. O'Neill Cruz. Congratulations. You're going to Texas.
Oh man. You know what? Since you've mentioned this survey multiple times and I got about 45 minutes until our editors meeting, I need to complete my survey. I need to, as the managing editor of Just Baseball, I got to get on it. I got to submit the only all-star ballot that matters, which is our Google survey here, where we can formulate an article that'll come up, I think, right before the votes finally get announced when we get to the starters. So I'm going to do that.
I think you're just waiting for Lindor to have another 17-homer game. And you're like, okay, now I'm going to lock that in, and that's going to be good. You're just waiting for that to happen. When he does,
that's another 17-homer game, because that'll put him at 40 home runs on the season, and then obviously I have to plug him in there. It's a good point. Do I vote for Lindor? Find out in that article release.
Homer.
Probably not. I think I got Ellie. But we will be back with another edition of Who's Better Baseball soon. Appreciate all of you that tuned into our live stream today. Make sure you head over to our YouTube channel, Who's Better Baseball, where we break up these conversations into individual videos so you can go back, watch any of our previous shows in more bite-sized form. You can also find our podcast, Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen. If you want to tune into us when you're driving somewhere, you can find us there. Find us on social at Who's Better BB on Twitter. And we will be back with another episode as we continue to talk All-Star Deadline and everything else.